Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. I want to welcome you to our final talk in the Leading Voices in Energy, Sustainability, and Security lecture series. My name is Andy Friedland. I'm a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program, and I've had the privilege of leading the series this summer. I want to thank the Office of the President at Dartmouth for coordinating the series, and especially Christine McDonald, Naraya Brodus, and Adita Robinson. So thank you, all three, for your help with this. I also want to thank the 18 undergraduates, many of whom are in the front row and some are sitting around the auditorium, who have contributed each week to an excellent course and superb classes we've had with the speakers that we have our own class prior to the public lecture. And I want to thank many of you who I recognize because I think you've been here for maybe all of the lectures. So thank you very much. Our series has considered policy, science, engineering, law, and design aspects of energy. In our final week, as we often do in human societies, we turn to a storyteller to help us make sense of it all. By story, I don't mean a made-up story. I mean a purposeful weaving together of facts and circumstances. And Seamus McGraw is a reporter and a fabulous storyteller. And that's what he's done in his book, The End of Country, published by Random House. Copies are available here for sale by the Norwich Bookstore afterwards, and Seamus is happy to meet with you, sign your book, or just say hello. So the book, The End of Country, Dispatches from the Frack Zone, that's the full title, is a superb recounting of what happened as the Marcellus Shale was exploited for natural gas in Pennsylvania. So take a look at it if you haven't read it already. Seamus McGraw grew up in an area of Pennsylvania that could now be called Frack Central. He has written articles for Reader's Digest, Penthouse, The Forward, Spin, The Huffington Post, and The New York Times, among others. As he tells us at one point in the book, as his life was taking one turn after another, not all of them good, he thought he could add something to the popular press feeding frenzy covering the issues of fracking. And in my opinion, he was absolutely right. Every month, I start books on environmental and energy topics, but I don't finish very many of them. I did finish The End of Country not once, but 3 times. And that's why I'm delighted to hear from the author in person. So please join me in welcoming Seamus McGraw.
Thank you. That was lovely. That was lovely. I'm going to start by answering the question that I know is foremost on everyone's mind at the moment. And the answer is, yes, I do realize I look like a member of a Village People tribute band. Or like Michael Flatley from Lord of the Dance. But there's a reason why I'm dressed like this. And the reason is that I rode my motorcycle here to deliver this talk. And there's a reason why I do that. As those of you who've read the book know, one of the reasons is that I am in the throes of a truly epic midlife crisis and have been since I was about 25. The other reason is that I get to indulge that midlife crisis at 75 to 115 miles per hour and 50 miles to the gallon. And it is often overlooked in our conversations about energy. How important the role of conservation is. And so I kind of do that. There's another reason, a story I told Andy earlier today. There's another reason why I'm channeling my inner Michael Flatley. And it's because last year, American University made the book required reading for its incoming freshmen. And so I had to go down and deliver a talk to American University, to 2,000 freshmen and sophomores. And I did that opening line that I do all the time, and I turned around and I said, and there is one other reason, and it's because of what I believe is the best review of End of Country ever written. And it was a review that was written by one of the students in the room that day. It wasn't published in the New York Review of Books or in any newspaper, you know. It was a tweet. And the tweet said, in its entirety, and I quote, "Seamus McGraw is a douche lord and should never have written a book." And I said, yes, ladies and gentlemen, I am the lord of the douche. But the point that I was making was actually slightly larger. It's that when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, and I was dragooned into reading a book that I really didn't want to read, 3 guys in a bar knew about it. One of them sitting in the back of the room right now. 3 guys in a bar knew about it. Right now, we live in a world where there is no line anymore between the guy who writes the book and the guy who reads the book. Where a book isn't an artifact anymore. It isn't the end of a conversation. It's the beginning of an ongoing conversation. And that's what I hope to do tonight. That's what I hope to continue doing after I hop on my bike and leave here. Folks, there is an ongoing conversation in this country. Some of it's taking place on my Facebook page with most of the people who are in the book, most of the experts on this subject. My email address is seamusm@ptd.net. Let's keep the conversation going after we have this talk here tonight, all right? Because there is probably no more important discussion than we can have. This isn't just about fracking. This is about energy. This is about economics. This is about environment. And this is ultimately about character. This is about who we are as a people. Now, when I do these talks, I usually start by doing something that's too clever by half. I'll turn around and I'll say, you know what? The USDA recommends that every person in this room gets 18 milligrams of iron every single day. And I add that, you know what? I will bet that half the people in this room haven't gotten it. But hey, I live almost entirely on caffeine and nicotine, so I'm not going to throw stones. And then you know what I do? I throw stones. You know what that is? Coal. Ordinarily, what I would throw would be a bag probably about 10 times that size. I would throw 18 pounds of coal onto the floor. Do you know why? Anybody can tell me why I would throw 18 pounds of coal on the floor? Daily consumption. That's what you're going to burn today. And you, and you, and you, and you, and every person you know is going to burn 18 pounds of coal. And in order to get that 18 pounds of coal, they have to remove 16 times that much earth, releasing all kinds of toxins. A grave-size hole every single day for every man, woman, and child in America in order to produce the single dirtiest, deadliest, most destructive form of energy there is. It killed my great-grandfather in 1901. It was linked to the deaths of 34,000 people worldwide last year. Now, if we had been having this conversation just a couple of years ago, that 18 pounds of coal would have been 19.64 pounds. We have, in the last couple of years, dramatically reduced our consumption of coal, and in dramatically reducing our consumption of coal, we are the only developed country to have reduced our carbon output to an amount basically around the equivalent of where we were at in, say, 1993. How have we done it? Well, we've done it in a couple of ways. The first is that we've made tremendous strides in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of our vehicles, in terms of our appliances. Tremendous strides. We've produced a staggering amount of new renewable energy. I was just out in West Texas a couple weeks ago for the new book. Everywhere you look, wind farms. Pennsylvania alone, okay? 795 megawatts of wind power, 23 wind farms, on its way to 900. On our best day, it accounts for about 14% of what we consume. It's not enough, but it's something. Efficiency, renewables. Third way is that we did it the good old-fashioned way. We ran the economy off the cliff. You want to turn around and you want to reduce your carbon footprint? Reduce your GDP. We did a remarkable job of doing that. Last year, if you guys will remember, during the Republican primary, Newt Gingrich said that he could lower the price of gasoline to $2 a gallon, and everybody turned around and said, "Oh, what a charlatan, you can't possibly do that." I was like, no, you can do it. We've done it before. You simply slam the economy into a wall, and it works. Works every time. But you know what? We've been growing at 1, 2, 2.5% a year for the last couple of years. So that, in and of itself, is not it. So what's the largest reason? Well, if you listen to the IEA and the EIA, they'll tell you that the single largest reason is because we've been able to unleash these vast reserves of natural gas. And that as a result, we have reduced our carbon output by an amount equal to the total carbon output of a place like Great Britain, where the Industrial Revolution began. But you know what, folks? We've done that without any kind of plan. That's all unseen hand stuff. And what the unseen hand giveth, the unseen hand taketh away, and it flips you the bird on the way out the door. Because that same EIA report that talks about how we've eroded coal over the last few years, 4 paragraphs down, it tells you that as the price of natural gas rises, it'll become less competitive with coal, and whatever advantages we've gotten from this will be erased. I bring this up to make a point. I'm not going to tell anybody in this room what to think. I remain deeply ambivalent about this. Deeply ambivalent about this. But I will say this. Anyone who tells you that this can be developed safely and with little to no environmental risk is either misinformed or is intentionally misleading you. But by the same token, anyone who tells you that there is not a real, achievable, short to medium term good that can come from this is also misinformed or is intentionally misleading you. Whether we do that is an open choice. It is a test of our character. I want to ask you guys a question. Hands. What is fracking? What is it?
Technological advance that's come about lately that allows you to open up the rock strata to release petroleum reservoirs.
Okay, all right. How do you do it mechanically? How does it happen mechanically? What does it actually do to the rock?
High pressure liquid
Does what to the rock?
splits it, cracks it,
Fractures it.
just ever so slightly.
That's about 99.9% right, but I'm going to add something to it. When you blast this mixture of water, sand, and chemicals down into a mile and a half down into the earth, you are not fracturing the rock. What you are actually doing is exploiting existing fractures in the rock. If the rock wasn't already fractured, if it wasn't already under pressure, this would not be economic. This would not be profitable. You are exploiting existing fractures in the rock. And I argue that what is happening a mile and a half below the surface is a metaphor, a mirror image of what's happening on the surface. You have, across this country, and particularly in my corner of Pennsylvania, you have these communities that are already damaged and have been for decades. Have been for decades. And you have people who are coming into these communities on both sides of the issue, exploiting these existing fractures, often to advance an agenda that has little to do with the subject at hand. I've probably done 65 of these talks around the country over the last year and a half, 2 years. And I have found, to my horror, that if I know where you stand on the subject of high volume hydraulic fracturing, I probably know where you stand on a half dozen other hot button issues in this society. I probably know where you stand on issues involving life. I probably know where you stand on issues involving the responsibility of the banksters. I probably know where you stand on the issue of abortion. I find with an alarming degree of accuracy that these all become a kind of ideological litmus test. And to me, that is a goddamn tragedy. Because it means we are not dealing with these subjects on their own merit. We are not evaluating the risks and benefits. We are evaluating our cultural identity. Andy told you I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. That's what I get paid for. And I'm going to tell you a story. Right after Hurricane Irene, and I know you guys remember Hurricane Irene, I was doing a talk in a little river town. Now, I'm not going to tell you where this river town was. And the reason I'm not going to tell you where this river town was is if those of you who studied this issue know that polls have shown that very often geography is a very good indicator of where you stand on the issue of fracking. The further you are from the fields, the more likely you are to oppose it. I'm not even going to tell you the person's gender, because studies have also shown that men tend to break one way on this subject, whereas women tend to break another way on the subject. Not universally, but enough to turn around and draw a conclusion. I'm not going to tell you those things because it doesn't matter which side of the issue this person was on. But I'm doing this talk in this little river town, and it's right after Hurricane Irene, and I think this is a really good chance to turn around and have a discussion about the issue of fracking and how it relates to the larger issue of reducing carbon and trying to avert the worst potential outcomes of climate. And the way I do these talks is I will talk a little bit, I'll read a little bit, and then I throw it open to questions. And I throw it open to questions, and this person stands up and cites an event, an absolutely earth-shattering an event that if it had actually happened would have been front page news around the world. It would have been on a par with the BP disaster or Bhopal or the collapse of Enron. It would have been something of that magnitude. It never happened. It never happened. But I could look in this person's eyes and I could tell that they were not lying to me. They believed with all their heart that this event that they had just laid out had actually happened. Now, I don't usually get enough people at my readings to risk pissing any of them off. So rather than turn around and confront this person directly, I asked a few questions, a few probing questions. I got about to the third question, and this look of terror came across this person's eyes. Person started to realize that perhaps this entire construct that they had might not hold up. Person stands up, storms to the door, spins on their heel, looks at me and says, I swear to God, this is a direct quote, says, I am not going to argue with you, I am comfortable in my ignorance, and storms out. My first reaction was, to borrow a phrase from my Australian wife, I was gobsmacked. My second reaction was, we need to take up a petition and have that put on our goddamn money because it's who we've become. This is the way we have our debates. Our debates take place across those surface fractures in our culture. There is, however, a way to bridge those. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, but there's something I want to digress for a second. We're pretty far here from ground zero in terms of the fracking debate. There's no natural gas here to speak of. This is not likely to be fracked. There is, however, a certain level of, I think, moral responsibility that goes beyond simply the responsibility of anyone in an academic setting. When I got here yesterday, this morning actually, when I woke up, I took a walk and I came across a place called Crosby Hall. Are any of you guys familiar with Crosby Hall? Okay. Crosby Hall is a little white building just off the green. And back in the 1850s, it was a laboratory. And a guy by the name of Beaver came back from western Pennsylvania with a sample of stuff that was hawked back in those days as a miracle cure-all. Okay, it was stuff called Pennsylvania rock oil. They used to sell it, you could drink it, okay, and they'd sell it. And they did tests to turn around and determine whether or not there were other possible uses for the stuff. And they determined that, hey, you know what? This could be an interesting replacement for whale oil. And two of the guys who were hanging out there at the time, students from the 1840s named Bissell and Everett, a few years later found themselves stuck in a hotel in Pittsburgh when this down-on-his-luck railroad guy stumbled in, and they got to talking. By the end of the evening, they had set up a company. The company they set it up in this way because the railroad guy was a dream come true. Because he was, sort of out of the business, but still had spent years on the railroad, he could travel anywhere for free. I mean, this was a real, shoestring operation. And so they set up a company called Seneca Rock Oil. And they sent this guy up to the field to see what he could come up with. The guy's name was Edwin Drake. Anybody know that name? Edwin Drake drilled the first successful oil well in the United States and launched the age of oil. And it all pretty much started across the street. Back to my original subject for a second, though. I talked about trying to have this discussion across the cultural fractures. It's very, very difficult. But it can be done. And in the book, some of you have read it, I introduce two people who live on opposite sides of that cultural fracture, who managed to find a way of coming together. And I'd like to introduce you to those of you who haven't read the book, to a couple of them. The first is one of my personal heroes, a woman by the name of Victoria Schweitzer. In fact, when I read from my book, I'll sign whatever books you guys want, but when I read from my book is signed by Victoria, who is one of the people who made the first stand against some of the more egregious excesses of one particular company, and by Terry Engelder, the professor from Penn State, who is generally regarded as the godfather of the Marcellus. Both of these people I am proud to call friends. And when you talk to these people, they think they're on opposite sides of the issue. But when I talk to them, I realize that they have a lot more in common than either of them realize, and a lot more shared purpose than either of them realize. And I'm going to introduce you to Victoria first, and then I'm going to introduce you to another old buddy of mine named Ken Eli. Like most newcomers to the country, Jim and Victoria had been enthralled by the ambient song of solitude, the gentle babbling of the tiny brook at the edge of their property, the insistent hum of 100,000 insects, the call and response of hawks and sparrows, the wind rustling through the ancient hemlocks, the call of an owl far off in the woods. It reminded Victoria of the night she had spent at her grandmother's place, lying on the grass with her siblings, watching the stars twinkling above her and listening to the sounds of the living dark forest. But there are other sounds in the country, too, the harsh, mechanical sounds of people trying to get by in a place where you have to fight the land itself for everything you have. It's the angry howl of a chainsaw chewing through downed trees so somebody can stock up on enough firewood to keep the house warm for the winter. It's the bitter protest of a lumber truck or a rock truck or a milk truck engine braking so that it can safely make it down some precipitous side road one hill over, or the guttural growl of a tractor with a 30-year-old muffler hauling a spreader full of oozing manure down the road. That's the moment when newcomers learn for the first time what cow shit really smells like. And then, one morning over coffee, they heard it, a sound that set their teeth on edge, rolling straight down the hill toward them from Ken Ely's place. It was a nightmare in the cool light of morning. It was every obnoxious industrial sound the region could offer and then some. The shriek of the chainsaw, the coughing and sputtering of an engine and a backhoe well past its prime. Worse still, there was the bizarre, animalistic shriek of steel on cold stone. It echoed through the trailer and through Jim and Victoria's skulls. Worst of all, there was the blasting. Fortunately, it wasn't an everyday occurrence, and it wasn't as if they could do anything about it anyway. The law said Ken had the right to blow up his rocks, and Ken was going to blow up his rocks, though the law also required that Ken hire someone to do the actual blasting, a condition to which he reluctantly submitted. For Jim and Victoria and their German Shepherd, that meant that there was nothing to be done but listen for the periodic sounding of the air horn, warning that the blasting was about to begin, grab the nearest solid surface, and hang on. Her neighbors had advised her against challenging Ken directly. He wasn't the type to take the admonishments of strangers kindly, and she tried to take their advice. Really, she had tried. The problem was she was constitutionally incapable of stopping herself, she admitted. Maybe it was her father's legacy. As a kid back in Falls, a tiny little town along the Susquehanna River, right between the rugged hollows of the endless mountains and the burned-out coal fields of the Wyoming Valley, she had watched her old man with unabashed admiration as he took on the big boys, the local, county, and state government and big business, to block the construction of a power plant he was convinced would further poison the already wounded river. He's a tough little guy, she used to say, and she had always been proud of him for winning that fight. And when she became a history teacher, she had chosen to teach a few miles south of Dimmock in Tunkhannock, partly so she could be close to the mountains she had come to love. She had always tried to infuse her lessons with a little bit of the individual versus the corporate state complex message that she had learned from her father. She had to admit that it had sometimes proven a little difficult to squeeze a morality tale about the zoologist Diane Fossey's brutal murder into her lesson plan, and she did raise a few eyebrows around the administration office when she got one of her classes to adopt, virtually of course, a mountain gorilla in Fossey's honor. But the school teacher in her couldn't resist the temptation to take Ken Ely to school. It didn't happen right away. Whenever she got a chance, she'd grab her dog and head off on a hike along the top of the ridge, and she'd peer over the chest-high stone wall that marked the boundary of Ken Ely's land, hoping to catch sight of him. But Ken Ely was a wily and elusive man, and the first month she had lived there, she had seen him only once, and then from a distance when he came roaring through the woods on a rattletrap ATV decked out in camouflage. As she later put it, she could have sworn she heard banjo music. For the longest time after that, she'd half try to catch him, stalking up to the rock wall whenever she suspected he might be at work, but each time when she got there, he had vanished. It was unnerving, she told me. In fact, she said she often had the feeling as she and her dog walked along her side of the stone wall that someone or something, maybe a deer, maybe a bear, maybe even one of those long-gone catamounts that still turn up from time to time in the imaginations of the locals, was watching her. As it turned out, she was right. One day she caught sight of something moving through the woods, and then it emerged, hesitantly at first, a clownish blue-tick coonhound with friendly, questioning eyes, grinning goofily and wagging its tail tentatively as it approached her, cocking its head, pleading to be petted. She had made contact with Ken Ely's dog. It was only a matter of time before she'd face the man himself. And then one afternoon, a short time later, while Victoria and her dog were hiking along near the top of the ridge, there they were, Ken and his dog, not far from the stone hedge that marked the end of her land. This might be her only chance to make him understand. "You know, you're killing the land," she blurted out as the coonhound slowly skulked away. Ken remained silent. He just stood there, glaring at her with what she would later come to learn was that patented Ken Ely scowl that most of his neighbors and all of his grandchildren had long since learned to ignore. She screwed up her courage and kept on talking. His rock quarrying was more than just an aggravation to his neighbors, she explained, though it was destroying the pastoral silence she had been fantasizing about since she was a child. It was an assault on the pristine beauty of the place. The way she saw it, his quarry was a cancer on the land, though even she grimaced when she used that phrase, thinking maybe it was just a bit over the top. Still, the school teacher in her couldn't pass up an opportunity to educate the quarryman, and if he took it badly, well, that was unfortunate. He'd just have to get over it. Ken Ely, of course, saw things differently. The way he told it, it wasn't Victoria's bluntness that irked him in that first encounter as much as it was her attitude. She seemed typical of a breed of newcomer, people who act like they know the place because they can name the little villages that dot the highway, places so small you'd need a magnifying glass to find them on a map. They always seemed to be looking down their noses at people like him, but as hard as he had tried to ignore his new neighbor, there was something about her that had just gotten under his skin. It wasn't that she hadn't grown up in these hills and didn't understand what he and the others who lived there did, that what a man does on his own land is his own business. It was that she did live here now, and somehow that made her think that she had a vote on what he did with his land, or at least the right to state her opinion, and that was what Ken couldn't abide. As he put it to me, she didn't seem to understand that this isn't some vacation spot, some pristine corner of the wild that could be pressed into the pages of a book like an old corsage. The land was all Ken and most of his neighbors had. In the past, people like Ken had taken from it whatever their abilities and the particular limitations of their own land would allow: corn, milk, timber, stones, and if that wasn't enough, and it usually wasn't, they'd take a little more. But for most, the days when you could make a living farming the land and maybe timbering it a bit were over. The farms were largely gone, and that meant that you could either carve up the cadaver of the land and sell off small chunks to folks like Victoria, or you could carve out what you needed and measure it out in tons. Ken had chosen the latter. Still, he never took more than the land was willing, however grudgingly, to give, and the land was more resilient than people like Victoria realized. You could tear it up with plows and bury it under mountains of fertilizer. You could hack down its trees and blast out its rocks with dynamite. You could ship the shards of rock down to the valley where rich people would use them to put facades on their McMansions or build little stone walls to evoke that fake country charm so prized these days. But the minute you stopped plowing or digging or blasting, the land would start to come back. Sure, you could kill it if you were greedy or careless enough. You could dig too deep, take too many trees, poison the land or the water with fertilizer. But if you did that, you knew you'd have nothing left at all. The way Ken Ely saw it, the land he owned didn't owe him a fortune, it owed him a living, and not necessarily an easy one. In return for every dollar's worth of stone the land yielded, it was due a gallon of sweat plus a few pounds of aching muscle and a few feet of creaking bone. But if, in Ken's calculus, the land owed him next to nothing, he owed everything to the land. He owed it his hard work, his constant attention, and most of all, his respect. And it was on that question of respect that he and Victoria diverged. To him, people who only visit the country from time to time, or who never visit it at all and only imagine it as a world wholly separate from their own, respect for the land often means leaving it untouched. To such people, it all boils down to one word: preservation. It's an admirable idea, one that has been embraced by some of the great heroes of American history and has led to the creation of Yosemite and Yellowstone National Parks, among other treasures. But to people like Ken, respect for the land means something else entirely. It means understanding in a visceral way that the land can be an ally, it can be an adversary, and sometimes it is both at the same time. But always, its fate and yours are linked. And so you push the land as hard as you can. And when you think it's just about ready to start pushing back, you let it rest. You move to the next quarry, the next stand of hardwoods, the next pasture, and if need be, you nurture it back to health. You seed, you plant, and what you harvest is up to you. Do that, and the land will always come back. That was Ken's guiding principle. There's a word for that, too: conservation. It's stunning how often the words preservation and conservation are used interchangeably in casual conversation. It's especially striking when you realize how different their meanings actually are. Ken and his jury-rigged backhoe were different, even if he didn't care about the land, and he did, passionately. Though he was never one to show his passions publicly. Ken's little operation could never do that kind of damage. I understood that. We both knew the land as a resource and a refuge, a place that, as the old saying goes, had been rode hard and put away wet. I couldn't help but remember the old Groucho Marx line about Doris Day: "I knew her before she was a virgin." That was Ken's relationship to the rocky ground, and it was, in many respects, mine, too. While Ken had wisely held his tongue during that first encounter with Victoria, he wasn't entirely silent. The way he wryly remembered it, it wasn't long afterward that he got his chance to offer a rebuttal, and it consisted of simply standing his ground. He had finished prying and scraping and dragging out every loose rock he could find in that part of the quarry, and now it was time to bring in the big guns. Enough dynamite placed just deep enough into the fractures in the rock to blast free a new load. And he called in some local guys to do the job. Ken watched as the contractors pulled back a safe distance and then listened for the air horn to sound. An instant later, the ground shook and a massive bone-rattling roar rolled up out of the ground and down toward the rusted old trailer at the bottom of the hill like an invisible wave. The bark of a purebred German shepherd told him that he'd let Victoria know that he wasn't going to change his ways just because she told him to. There is one other part, one of the things that I find so hopeful is that Ken and Victoria, as different as they were, they didn't share much in the way of what we would ordinarily consider to be values. But they did find common purpose. And I find that hopeful. But I find it rare. There's a story I like to tell. For those of you who've been following the fracking issue in the East, you know that there are two centers of gravity. Penn State, to some degree, is the academic center of gravity for the development of the Marcellus. Its opposite number is Cornell, which is sort of ground zero for the opposition to development of the Marcellus in New York State and elsewhere. And I have a lot of friends in both places, and I was up doing one of these talks in Cornell, actually in Ithaca itself, and I stepped out to have dinner, which, as I already explained to you, is coffee and cigarettes. And I'm out smoking a cigarette, and a car comes by. And the car had a bumper sticker. And the bumper sticker said, "Fracking is immoral." Now, setting aside for a moment the low-hanging fruit, the obvious irony of putting a statement like that on a petroleum product bumper sticker, I am telling you absolutely sincerely, this is going to sound sarcastic, it is not. I mean this absolutely sincerely. My first reaction was complete and total envy. I envied that kind of moral certainty. I don't have it about anything, but certainly not about this. I'm going to introduce you to somebody who I hope can kind of help you understand why. Of all the neighbors, no one more clearly embodied the pressures that the local farmers were under to sign than Rosemary Greenwood. A warm and friendly woman, she had immediately invited me into her house when I showed up unannounced and made me a cup of coffee. She would have offered me something more substantial, like a homemade muffin, but told me her oven had broken months before and she couldn't afford to replace it. There was no secret why she had signed on. Everybody knew it had been a rough couple of years for her. She had been widowed 2 years earlier. Even though her husband had smoked 3 packs of Pall Malls every day of his adult life as he struggled from before dawn to after dark to keep the farm his family attended for 3 generations from going under, it was ultimately colon cancer that killed him. Looking at Rosemary, it would have been hard to imagine that she could be from anywhere else. Though well into her 60s and though the years of struggle had lined her face, she was still lithe in an almost girlish way, and in her barn boots and loose-fitting bargain store sweats, she seemed perfectly at home, scampering up the slippery ladder of a silo or tossing hay from a mow. But the truth was, to Rosemary Greenwood, farming was a kind of indentured servitude. As one of her neighbors once put it, dairy farming's a lot like being in prison, except that in prison you don't have to get up twice a day and milk the guards. Farming wasn't really in her blood. Rosemary had been born and bred down in the valley, down in the coal mining town of Taylor, south of Scranton, and probably never would have set foot on a farm if she hadn't been swept off her feet 4 decades earlier by a good-looking farm boy who had come down to a local dance in the valley. The next thing she knew, she was a bride, and the next thing she knew after that, she was cutting hay and milking cows and pitching insilage, chopped corn cobs and stalks from the top of a 50-foot silo. And then in the fall of 2002, her husband started to weaken. Rosemary had promised him on his deathbed that she would try to keep the farm going. That's what he had wanted. That's what her eldest son, Todd, wanted too. And for a while, they were able to make a go of it. But within 3 years of her husband's death, things were starting to become desperate. That too was linked in no small part to the price of oil. See, in the spring of 2005, as a result of a complex federal pricing structure that had been in place since the Great Depression, Rosemary was getting about $11.40 for every 100-pound of milk, regardless of what it cost a consumer on the shelf. That worked out to about $1 per gallon of milk produced at a time when the national average cost of a gallon of milk was about $2.32. Back then, it cost her about 26 cents to produce that gallon of milk. But energy prices were spiking, and so were Rosemary's costs. The cost of diesel for the Ford tractor was going up. They were now spending a few $100s a week just to keep it running. Nobody could afford to run a tractor for long at those prices, she said. And the cost of feed for their 72 head of Holstein was going up too, and that was also linked to the cost of fuel, more than 60% of which was then imported into the United States. The federal government estimates that fuel accounts for about 40% of the cost of growing corn, and that does not take into account the hidden energy cost as more and more corn was diverted from the great national food machine to be used as feedstock for the energy-intensive alchemy required to create ethanol and other biofuels. It had gotten to the point where grain alone cost Rosemary and her son $3,500 every 12 days. And the price of seed corn was already starting its climb from $3 to $8 a bushel. It was only a matter of time, she knew, until for the first time in her life, she'd be in debt to the feed store. But what choice did she have? Energy costs were taking a 30% bite out of the farm's gross revenues, and that was just in terms of operating expenses. Like everybody else in America, she had to live. And living in a rural community like Dimmock meant that she had to drive long distances, sometimes 40 miles or more, to get to a shopping center or make a doctor's appointment. And that meant buying ever costlier gasoline to fill the tank of the gas-chugging SUV she needed just to navigate these back roads during the snowy northeastern Pennsylvania winters, or to slog through the axle-deep Pennsylvania mud in spring. The narrow profit margins that the farm had relied on had never been enough to put aside enough cash to adequately insulate the 150-year-old farmhouse she lived in, and it was now costing her $100 a month to buy the oil to heat the place, and that too was going up. Everybody else on the dairy farm food chain could factor all those costs into their prices, and they did. While the price of a gallon of milk on American store shelves was fast approaching $4, farmers were still getting $1. And unlike the big corporate farmers who could use economies of scale to guarantee their profits, many, like Rosemary, were falling behind. Most of the other farmers on the road from Dimmock had seen the writing on the wall after the first fuel crisis, the Arab oil embargo of 1973, or the second one, the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979, or the third one, the run-up to the first Gulf War in 1991. Just like Cleotille, they had thrown in the towel. Some had retired, some had found other jobs, though those were getting harder to come by. As the farmers went under, at least in part because of the cost of fuel, so did the companies that relied on them. Local mills that for 100 years had ground the corn that the farmers grew into grain had gone belly up. Local dairies that processed the milk had gone out of business too. There were other costs as well. Costs that are harder to factor into the ledger books. These were the hidden price we pay to try to keep those foreign energy sources flowing, those intangible costs we don't speak of generally when we draw a line between the price of a gallon of gas and the price of a gallon of milk. Costs that are calculated not in dollars, but in lives. See, in places like Susquehanna County, when the jobs get scarce, so do the young people who used to live there. Those who can leave do, and those young men and women who don't have the resources to move away have to find some other way of getting by. In the spring of 2005, the local paper had run a story about how 59 young men and women from Susquehanna and 2 adjacent counties, all attached to the National Guard unit in nearby New Milford, had just shipped out to Iraq. A lot of people in Susquehanna County lingered a little longer over the news pages that day before turning to the coupons. So it was no surprise that when the West Virginian in the white pickup truck showed up at her place at the end of 2005, Rosemary was only too happy to invite him inside. To her, the $6,400 he was offering for a 5-year lease on her 256 acres of land was a godsend. It wasn't a fortune. There probably wouldn't even be enough left over after she paid her property tax to settle the bill at the feed store, let alone replace the old electric stove in her kitchen. The oven had given up the ghost not long after her husband had, and ever since, Rosemary had been living on canned soup, hot dogs, and anything else she could heat up on the top burners. But it was enough money to keep them going for maybe another year, and if it turned out that there really was gas down there, there could be a lot more money. You wouldn't even have to milk your cows anymore, the West Virginian had told her. You could just turn them out and let them go. She liked the sound of that. She inked her name at the bottom of the contract. You guys know who Aubrey McClendon is? Until recently, Aubrey McClendon was the chairman and CEO of Chesapeake Energy, the largest natural gas driller in the United States. Aubrey was also a funder of the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth. You guys remember the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth? Some of you younger guys who may not, when President Bush was running against John Kerry, there was a concerted effort. President Bush had spent the Vietnam War in a National Guard unit. John Kerry, whatever else you might think of him, was a decorated war veteran, combat veteran. And concerns that John Kerry might try to bring about a premature end to the war in Iraq prompted some people in the oil industry primarily to try to discredit him. The term swiftboat has now become a verb in politics, to use somebody's strength against them. Keep that in mind for a second. There is something I didn't tell you about those 59 young men and women who shipped out in 2005. Just about the time the landmen were starting to sew up their leases in the area. About the time the first well came through in Dimmock, 8 of those kids were killed in a roadside bomb in Fallujah. And I happened to be talking to Mr. McClendon. And I mentioned those kids to him. And this is what Mr. McClendon said to me. And I quote, "I'm not going to tell you that that was a war for oil, but I will tell you that if there wasn't oil, there wouldn't have been a war there." So maybe you can understand how when I step out onto the streets of Ithaca to smoke a cigarette and see a bumper sticker that says, "Fracking is immoral," maybe you can understand why a big part of me wishes I had that kind of moral certainty. But maybe you can understand a little why I don't. Your turn, folks. That's what I got. Let's talk. Don't clap, it'll only encourage him. Questions, come on. If you just want to throw stuff, that's fine. What?
On television these days, there are a lot of ads showing farms and talking about farming, and it ends up about natural gas and how farms can survive on natural gas. And it's a very subtle, goodwill-ish kind of an ad about how good it is for our community, and it's driving me crazy.
It is both. Honestly, it is both.
It is what?
It is both. Okay, if you're getting your information from commercials, if you're getting your information from faux documentaries on either side of the issue, you're getting questionable information. Okay, but I understand. I'm speaking. It's not you personally. I'm not suggesting that you are. I'm not suggesting that anyone in this room is. Okay. The reality is there are real and profound risks. Risks of surface spills. Okay. Risks associated. I spent a lot of time today talking about what I think is the two largest concerns of this. I'm less concerned about the fracking fluid itself per se as I am about the produced water over the long period of time. I'm less concerned about it contaminating aquifers from below than I am in contaminating aquifers from above. But the reality is, okay, carelessness, recklessness, okay, bad luck, stupidity, okay, and things we don't know can all put some of these farms at risk. But I will tell you something else. The farm next to ours, best cattleman I ever knew. Best cattleman I ever knew, and he knew nothing else. 2 years ago, he couldn't do it anymore. 2 years ago, he could no longer make a living, and he liquidated his herd. This year, he's begun a cow and calf operation, and he would not have been able to do that had it not been for this. A couple miles away, I can point to farms where there have been tremendous mishaps. Both of these things are true. The question is, which of them is manageable? Which of them is manageable? And again, that becomes a question of character. Most of the problems, if we honestly look at it in terms of surface spill, in terms of in terms of methane migration, in terms of the air pollution released by the diesel, okay, in terms of fugitive methane, these are mechanical problems. They may have mechanical solutions, but they don't have any solutions unless we have the will to do it. And the only way you're going to do that is to turn around and recognize that it has to be made part of their bottom line. And we're not doing that. So the risks are real, but at the same time, look, everything is a two-edged sword in this. You know, everything is a two-edged sword. Some of you guys are old enough to, you know, there is a tendency, I'll probably get more into this as we go. You had a question, yeah?
It seems that one way of sort of standing back and thinking about how it is that the woman in the story got into her situation, where she's sort of between a rock and a hard place, and also how it is that we are ambivalent about fracking, is partly that this is a downstream consequence of policy decisions we made or didn't make as a country. I mean, for example,
I think didn't make is more of it,
we
isn't
never
it?
really put in place a comprehensive, well-thought-through energy policy for the nation.
Not since the end of World War II. No,
We have lots of problems with our foreign policy. So how do you think about that in relation to the dilemmas that you're presenting to us?
This is an ongoing conversation. This is something I spoke with the students about earlier today. Okay, you're absolutely right. This country has not had an energy policy since the end of World War II, and an energy policy can't simply be an energy policy. An energy policy has to stand on three legs. An energy policy has to be an economic policy, it has to be an energy policy, and it has to be an environmental policy, and we've done none of that. The reality is, if you want to turn around and limit the ability of these guys to wreak havoc on us. What you need to do is make it in their interest. And the way you do that is by turning around and making it part. There is something that Aubrey McClendon has in common with Rosemary Greenwood. Not anymore, Aubrey's out, but any of these big drillers have in common with Rosemary Greenwood. And that is that neither one of them sets the price for their commodity. They are both up against a hard rock, okay? We could remove that hard rock, or we could use it to our advantage. And I think that's what we ultimately need to do, is use it to our advantage. And you use it to your advantage by turning around and saying, okay, you're losing somewhere between 4 and, say, 14% of the methane you're producing, okay, from wellhead to burner tip. You tell me you can reduce that by 85%? Do it, I'll give you a tax break. Otherwise, I'm going to drink your milkshake. You tell me you can turn around and reduce these methane contamination, the drifting methane problem, by using cement made out of fly ash? Do it, I'll knock you down another point. Otherwise, I'm going to drink your milkshake. You start using that. You start developing a policy that is both economic and at the same time, as you're doing this, you guys know what most of our spills in the state of Pennsylvania have been? They haven't been fracking fluid. They've been diesel related. They've been diesel related. There's a part in the book that I talk about where I'm out at a rig in southwestern Pennsylvania with a buddy of mine who works for Range, and he's telling me all the wonderful things that natural gas can do. I mean, we're going to use it to turn around and get off oil. We're going to turn around and use it for manufacturing. We're going to turn around and use it to generate electricity. We're going to do all these wonderful. I can just barely hear the guy over the roar of the diesel engine that's running the rig, over the roar of the diesel engines of the truck. I can just barely hear the guy. Finally, the guy takes pity on me. These guys have heard this story. He says, you know what? Let's go back to the office. We hop in his truck, a big Ford Exploder, and we start driving back to the office. The office is 3 miles away. About halfway there, the guy starts white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking down at the gas gauge, goes, I don't think we're going to have enough gas to get back. Sitting on top of the third largest energy field in the world. The irony is lost on this guy, okay? If they were to use this stuff to get this stuff, not only would it reduce the risk of spills, not only would it reduce the amount of air pollution that is generated, not only would it save them $800,000 per well, okay, but it would also turn around. The reason we don't run our garbage trucks, our school buses, our ambulances on natural gas is because we don't have the infrastructure. They say they're going to be in here for 30, 50 years. You turn around and you say, all right, you know what, I'm going to give you a tax break to start developing the use of natural gas to get natural gas. You build these hubs in these places you're going to be. You've reduced your liability, you've reduced your cost, and you've increased your market, and I'll give you a tax break. That's the kind of policy approach that we need, and nobody's doing it. And why? Part of it is that we can't get past the idea of polarization. And this happens on both sides. We have a boneheaded piece of legislation in the state of Pennsylvania called Act 13. Which basically hands the store over to the oil drillers. And about the time that was, I had turned around and given this talk, and I was getting much more specific in terms of policy approaches, and a state senator, okay, on the Democratic side, okay, came running up to me, turned around, he was so proud of himself. He had just come out of committee, and he voted against it, and I was like, that's great, now we have to do this, and the guy looks at me like a duck in thunder. And I realized the guy didn't have a clue what the hell I was talking about. He had voted against Act 13, not because he knew what was right and knew what was wrong. He voted against Act 13 because the other guys were voting for it. You want to turn around and change policy. The way you change policy is to sit down and talk to those guys, and try to educate them. But it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to happen. It may not happen in the 30 years we got to do this. So in the meantime, you do what you can. Yeah.
Maybe 2 more questions?
Oh, really? Yeah.
D. Boone Pickens, for a while, was a big advocate of natural gas. I believe he spent over $1 billion.
For a while? Are you kidding? You think he's still not out there flogging it?
He's not doing it now?
Oh, yes, he is. Read the Pickens play. Oh, yes, he is. Yes, he is. He is. What he has changed his point of view on is wind. Okay? And the reason is that wind has turned around and exploded. Read Kate Galbraith's new book, which is coming out from University of Texas Press, plug, that's where my new book is coming out from. Kate Galbraith's new book goes into that a great deal. The reason that T. Boone is not as enthusiastic about wind as he used to be is not because it's not working, it's because it's working too well and making the other guys the money. There isn't enough room in it right now for him to make a killing, but he is still flogging natural gas. He's become less enthusiastic about wind. You know, it's... And why? Because there's money to be made, you know. Use their instincts. Another question. Oh, yeah.
I'd like to address what you started with, the issue of not having an energy policy, but we also do not have a land use policy. We have grown up in the United States with a belief we have so much land that it was all there for the taking and for its use. As the population has grown and the pressures have grown, we have discovered we can no longer invoke that kind of thinking, and that worldwide. I want you to comment on it, because every form of energy has its land use issues.
Yeah. There's no question that I'm going to take off in a slightly different direction from you. Okay. I'm on record, anyone who knows this, I'm on record in terms of restricting access to all but timbering on most federal land. I'm opposed to the use of it for anything else, because that's why we set federal, national forests aside. That's why we have forests in Pennsylvania and other states, is to protect that as a resource. This is jeopardized. That said, okay, that's sort of an aside. I also think that this has the largest economic impact if it's done on private lands. That's another reason, okay? But the reality is, I told these guys this story earlier today too. I was talking to a guy out in California who was developing a solar facility, okay, in Riverside, California. He's since run into some financial trouble that has to do with things other than the plan itself. But this was going to be a 7,000-acre facility. Mixture of trough technology and PVs. Okay, about 85% PV, about 15% trough. And 7,000 acres. And we sat down and talked about the idea of, not just in terms of the amount of land that was going to be required, which was substantial, but the amount of energy that was going to be required in order to mine, manufacture, transport, smelt, okay, maintain, clear the land for this 7,000-acre facility, which when all was said and done would produce enough energy for 400,000 homes. There are 350 million people in America. We are going to have to repeat this again and again and again to get it at scale. Life expectancy at 35 years. By the time we're done, we're going to have to start all over. What kind of energy are we going to use to try to achieve that? The problem is, Jacobson's got a report that's wonderful, the idea that we can be fossil-free by 2060. Wonderful idea, great think piece. The reality is there's no such thing as a silver bullet, and even if there were, you'd have to mine the damn silver. What energy are we going to use to achieve that? What energy are we going to achieve that? What are the options we have? We have damn few options, and they're all bad. They all carry tremendous consequences. So we have to use the one that is least noxious. And making that judgment, that's a value judgment, folks. And it becomes a character test. Any more? You want me to shut up? All right.
Great place to end this series. Thank you.
Guys, I'm around. And listen. My Facebook is Seamus McGraw. My email address is seamusm@ptd.net. I am around. Look, I have no life other than this, all right? This goes on all the time. Please, join the conversation. Keep the conversation going.
Come on over and say hi and continue the discussion.
out. So it's
Wonderful,
sterile.
wonderful.